I actually started out as an equine veterinarian practicing in Minnesota about the time that Canterbury Downs opened. I think we opened our veterinary clinic across the street from Canterbury Downs about the same time, literally to the day that Canterbury Downs opened. And we were 1 year out of vet school. We had leveraged everything we had to pay to build this clinic. But it looked like a fun venture, and we figured we didn't have much money anyway. So if we went broke, we weren't going to be any further behind. So we did that, and slowly the practice grew from a racetrack practice to a more of a sports medicine practice, mainly because being a native Minnesotan, there was a time in history that I believe Minnesota, Hennepin County, had the highest per capita number of horses of anyone in the US, second to LA County. I think that number has changed massively, but there is a hunter jumper world that I chose to go into as Canterbury was having its problems, as many racetracks do. They go up and down, and it was time to say, how else do we provide income to this clinic if indeed the track were to go under, which it did do about 2 or 3 times, but it did manage to come back. I did that for about 8 years and was invited to do some surgery with a human medical device company that was developing new tools for the back, surgical tools. And I kind of became fascinated with that and decided that I wanted to pursue something more. So I went into law. It wasn't that I thought the world needed more lawyers. I had a very specific type of law I wanted to go into, and that was patent law to work on technology. And I practiced in a large private firm for another 7 or 8 years. And then I went to a large medical device company called Boston Scientific. And there I had the opportunity to work on all kinds of human medical devices, but also to build relationships with a lot of very top-notch engineers in various fields that were very good at dealing with bodily systems, human bodies. But when it comes right down to it, there's so many similarities between humans and animals that it was pretty translatable. But I knew I had started FLAIR with a colleague, Dr. Ed Block, who I started out as a veterinarian with. And then many years later, Ed and I were chatting, and the idea of the nasal strip came up. But at that time, I was practicing as a lawyer. So we kind of started FLAIR on the side. We worked with the Human Breathe Right company at the time, and they helped launch FLAIR. And then one day, their CEO told me that the board had called him in and said, we're a human consumer product company that sells things in pharmacies. What are we doing in the horse world? And at that time, we took the company back from them. And while working a corporate job, we just kind of ran FLAIR by the seat of our pants. We had inventory. We put ads up in magazines, very little. We had people like Philip Dutton, who were supporters for us way back when. And we just tried to get the message out as best as we can. But I knew when I got out of the corporate world, my goal was to get out of it and to focus on horse products. So back in about 2017, I could take retirement, and the goal was to just focus on equine products. So we are continuing to work on projects with FLAIR. But then in addition, we are looking at some other products as well too. And I've been blessed by the opportunity of many of the engineers I worked with at Boston Scientific had said, you got these horse projects. Would you ever need some help? And indeed I did. And so I've recruited a lot of these people that are behind the scenes working on a lot of the technologies we are working on.
That is so cool. And honestly, the horse world is so lucky to have you, Jim. Like, it is
Well,
incredible the work that you're doing, and we're all better for it. So we appreciate you having so many degrees and such a long resume.
that's very kind of you. As a kid, I wasn't raised in a horse family, but I always wanted horses, and I think I bought my first horse the day I turned 16 with a driver's license. And so my passion has always been horses. So I just took my vocation and hopefully transferred into an avocation. And it's great to be part of this community and the people that are in it.
That's the best path, is following what you're passionate in and finding your kind of role there. I love that. Well, for riders who haven't thought much about equine respiration, why should breathing be on our radar as a performance topic? Why is this so important? Why is this something that you have kind of devoted this part of your career to?
So have you ever heard of the old adage, uh, no foot, no horse? Yeah. Well, my feeling is if you don't have lungs, you don't need, doesn't matter if you have 4 feet, it just doesn't count. Because without lungs, you can't get the air you need to make those feet do anything. In the real world, I think respiratory conditions are the number 2 reason that horses are retired behind lameness, because I would never take anything away from the orthopedic issues we deal with. But respiratory is very important. And I had an Olympic rider say to me one time, yeah, we used to call it the silent organ. We just never thought about it unless your horse is coughing. Then you might think about it. But other than that, it does fall off the radar screen. But it's, I think, one of the most, if not the most critical organ to keep things going, because that's where all the oxygen comes to allow the horse to do what the horse does. And the horse's lungs are pretty impressive too, that help make it the super athlete it is. So remember, no lungs, it really doesn't matter how many feet you have.
I think that's so valid, and it rolls right off the tongue. We're going to get a bumper sticker
I have
with
to
that.
stop and think about it a minute.
When riders ask for more speed, power, or collection, what extra demands does that place on the horse's respiratory system?
All kinds of significant changes on the respiratory system, because we know it's almost linear that the faster a horse goes when you go from a walk to a trot to a canter, the more oxygen you're going to need to power it. So right off the bat, you are going to need more oxygen to come in. But when you do that, the horse's body goes through some pretty significant changes. And there comes to a point where the normal body adaptation to um, do that increased performance start to be overridden. And the lungs are probably the main organ that is least fit. It doesn't have the capacity to keep up with the hearts and the bones that we've been breeding for.
So as you say that, is it the lungs being a limiting factor? Kind of, what are the signals that is taking place? And like that's kind of what is holding your horse back.
It can be anything from fatigue, earlier fatigue, just not performing up to snuff, start dropping more rails. But think of yourself when you start to get tired. If you've been breathing hard, your whole body starts to give a little bit, right? I mean, your muscles are toned, and it's when people start to fatigue that the muscles aren't doing their job of keeping everything in place and keeping those joints in closed packed position when you hit the ground. And that's where injuries are going to start happening. But generally, it's going to be that horse just isn't there for you. Aside from, the noticeable cough, or if you have an incident of bleeding, those are the real obvious things to see. But otherwise, poor performance in general is one of the things that goes along with respiratory issues.
Yeah. When people think about kind of the likelihood of their horse having respiratory issues or that being an element in performance issues, are different breeds of horses, are they more inclined toward that? Like, is a thoroughbred going to have less issues with respiratory issues than a warm blood, or vice versa? Or is that not like a correlation?
Um, if it is, I'm not familiar. I shouldn't say that. There are some correlations that we do know. We do know there are certain respiratory conditions related to the throat that thoroughbreds notoriously have. But warm bloods, you see in warm blood, you see in quarter horses too. But it's some of the breeding we've done with these horses while we're pushing pedigrees to get more performance out of them. Like anything, nothing comes for free, and you start breeding in other problems. So you can see certain conditions in addition to right down to horses that have better endurance than other horses, right? Horses that can go longer distances like thoroughbreds, that's part of their internal genetics as well, as far as the systems they have to optimize or to utilize nutrition and how they perform overall. Some of that is just in the breeding over the years. We've obviously bred certain breeds for types of performance. Arabians, for example, really do have some increased endurance. We see those used in endurance racing. We know on the cross country course, when speed is king, you're going to go more to a thoroughbred than a warm blood. And jumping, it's different. And so there's some inherent things in the horse's breed that brings with them different performance optimizations or performance capabilities.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, can you explain the relationship between stride and breath in horses during exercise?
Sure. So let's just go back a few steps. And I said, when a horse starts picking up its speed, there are certain things that happen in its body to start getting more air in. And one of them is it flares its nostrils really big. Those open up big. Its trachea can actually expand and it gets bigger as well. And it's also going to increase its stride length. And its stride length allows it more time to bring in air, as well as it's correlated with the amount of speed you have. When a horse walks, trots, they're dissociated. That is, they can walk, but their breathing rate can be separate with their stride. Once a horse gets up to a canter and a faster canter, let's just work with a gallop, because I want to be careful of being absolute. There's some things I can say. Horses are obligate nasal breathers. They only breathe through their nose. Well, not really. They only breathe through their nose when they're running. When they're eating and they're in pasture, they can eat and still breathe and take some air in through their mouth. But when they're moving, they can't. And there are reasons for it physiologically. So I want to be careful of take by absolutes as a simple way of relaying information. But there's kind of gray areas at the transition zone. But when a horse starts to canter, its breathing and stride become locked. And what that means is that for every breath the horse takes, they take one stride. Or for every stride the horse takes, they take one breath. And so what it means when a horse is going very fast and they're doing 120 strides per minute, that means they're taking 120 breaths per minute. That means they get less than a half a second to pull in all the air they need, or to pull in air on that stride. And so horses are unique in how they do that and how these two become linked. But it works very efficiently. It helps drive the efficiency of the horse. And when they have to pull in as much air as they have to pull in to power their work, that stride and breathing makes it very efficient. And if you think of a bellows, and you think of the old-fashioned bellows that you pull it open and you're bringing air in, and you push it closed and you're forcing air out. When the horse starts running, its legs start doing that for them. And if you follow their stride, and I think there's something on our website, we take you through each phase of the stride, and it shows you where after the horse has come over a jump or gone through the airborne phase of their stride, they start extending their legs out, right? And they start bringing their front legs out, and they're pulling their chest open, and they're bringing air in until that lead foot on the front end hits the ground. That's it. They're done taking in air. The back end is coming forward now, and it's shoving it back out. So if you think about it, it's just a big bellows that takes things in and out. And what happens is it's the legs that are doing it, but they also have a very powerful diaphragm that is moving back and forth in stride with the legs, in sync with the legs, and it's pulling that air in. Once the horse gets to a certain point, though, where they will start to get tired is now that diaphragm needs more energy to keep it going. And so what's it going to do? It's going to take more blood to power that. Where did that blood come from? It came from the muscles. And so now the leg muscles that should be making that horse run are becoming depleted or reduced in the amount of oxygen from blood flow, because that blood has now been put into the diaphragm to keep them going. But the ability to bring this air in and out to begin with gives them a lot of capabilities. But at some point, the natural things that happen to help them go faster struggles against the endurance and speed requests we have of them when doing some of the performance activities we do with them.
Got it. So you hit a point where it becomes the mechanics of the body kind of become in conflict with one another. Is that fair?
Yeah, the mechanics of the body, the body is amazing in its capabilities of allowing any animal, but particularly horses, to do what they do. But even that at some time gets overloaded. And that happens when we ask a lot of the horse physically, and then the systems aren't going to be as efficient.
Yeah. Yeah. Does that happen after it depends on the horse and it depends on their kind of fitness. It happens at a certain point after they've gone a certain amount of time, kind of basically, does that start happening once they kind of hit their fitness limit, or is that kind of that moment?
It always exists, right? So let's go back a step, and that is when you take a young horse and you start training it, the kind of limiting organs are the bones and the muscles, and the heart. I mean, all of those muscles and bones are trainable. The lung isn't. But when we start out, the lungs do a pretty good job, and the horse is running around in the pasture and it's doing what it's doing. Now we start putting it into training, and when we put it into training, we're asking more and more. The lungs don't train. The lungs of a horse don't get better. The muscles of the legs become better. They become stronger. They have greater endurance. The bones have greater density, greater strength to reduce the likelihood of injury, and the heart becomes big. And we're breeding horses for big hearts because we want all that blood pumping. But we haven't bred to make the lungs any bigger. So they are the rate limiting organ.
Wow.
So what happens is at some point, the lungs just can't keep up with what's happening. But there's this, I won't say it's a belief or maybe a misunderstanding that we think we're making our lungs better. When we go running, I remember as a kid, you'd be running, you go, oh, it's my lungs. I'm running too hard. I can feel it. No, it's not. It's the rest of your body isn't ready. So your skeletal muscles build up mitochondria and the oxidative capacity that says this oxygen that the lungs given us, we're now more efficient at using it, and we get very efficient at it because we're only going to get so much from the lungs. So when a horse it's any phase of their training, they're training against what it is you're asking them to do it. Clearly, a horse that's been in a very intense training program, their musculature, their bones, their heart is going to be geared up for it. So when you say who's working harder, is it the horse that sits on the weekend and comes out and jogs around, or the 5-star cross country horse? Well, realistically, it just depends. That 5-star horse is fit, his body's ready for it. The horse that sits in the stall all weekend then gets taken out, that horse is going to work just as hard. But they're doing a lower level of work. And so the amount of intensity of fitness, it just depends on what you're asking the animal to do, but you can build up their capacity to make them more capable of doing it up to a point. And that's where, you're relying on your musculature and oxidative and systems in your body to metabolize lactic acid and other waste products of metabolism to get that horse to a point where it can perform at its peak. But again, it's relying on these other systems around the lungs that are getting very strong and optimized.
Yeah. Wow, that's really, really interesting. I did not realize that the lungs are something that they are what they are. You're not changing the I don't know, setup of the lungs, like the way you are with muscles and other, I mean, your heart or what have you.
Well, and the amount of air that the lung can take in is called its VO2 max. How much air can it come in? And that's limited because it's a space issue, right? You've got a rib cage that's this big and a heart that's this big, and now I want to take in a whole bunch more oxygen. You can't. There's only so much oxygen in the air, and it's just a concentration issue of if you've got this much space, then that air moving through the lungs is going to get absorbed by the blood vessels, and that oxygen is going to go throughout the power of the body. But we can't make the lungs bigger to get more air in. So we do know if we take oxygen, concentrated oxygen like you can see in a hospital room, and you stick it in a horse's nose, we know we can get their oxygen level up higher, but we don't get it up higher by training them. And again, there is some capacity of increasing VO2 max, and I'm hearing more people talking about it, but in general, that lung capacity doesn't change. So the horse can only get so much air in there at any one time, no matter how much you train them. It's not like a muscle that's getting stronger. It's just opening, doing the transfer of oxygen, carbon dioxide going the other way, and then it's blown back out.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay, what are the biggest challenges a horse's respiratory system faces during hard work?
Let's see. Well, the biggest thing is to think about is, which I have a bias on, is the nose. And we used to talk about it in vet school that horse was built by committee. Hence why horses are so prone to colic, because they're missing certain tissues in their guts that keep guts in position. And because a horse didn't have it, we can get twisted guts, problems like that. One of the things is they only breathe through their nose. And the reason it's theorized that happens is because the horse has a very long soft palate. And that soft palate can compartmentalize to only let the horse breathe through their nose. And one theory, and I'll say it's a theory because I don't know how we ever prove these things without a doubt, is the horse is a prey animal. And so when they're doing their normal thing of walking and grazing, and all of a sudden they're startled by a predator, and they got a mouthful of food and they've got to suck in air, there's going to be a problem because they're going to take that air and shove it right down their throat into their lungs. However, if over time they adapted this thing called a soft palate that all of a sudden says, okay, mouth, you are now separate from nose. So anything that's in your mouth, you can spit it out, you can do what you want with, but it's not going anywhere. Air, you're coming through here, and it makes a closed passageway from the nostrils to the lungs, which is great for this grazing problem and not choking, but it also means the only place a horse gets air is through their nose. And the narrowest part of that nose isn't the nostrils. The nostrils get pretty darn big. If you watch a horse's nostrils when they come back from it's right behind it. It's in the nasal passages. That's the narrowest part of the upper airway. And that is one thing is as a horse works harder and it needs to bring in more air, it does so by generating big vacuum pressure. Remember we talked about this bellows, and this bellows drawing air in. Bellows is a vacuum or a strong suction pressure to pull air in, right? When that happens, you got the nasal passage, but you also have the trachea. And all of those tissues, when there's strong negative pressure, can collapse on them. So the harder they work, the more these soft tissues can collapse on them. And so they need to balance that to get the air in without everything collapsing when they need it. Now, a horse with a pathology like a pharyngeal issue, an issue just ahead of the throat, there's some pretty interesting pathological conditions. When these horses breathe hard, that whole pharynx closes down. So you can think of it, if just imagining what your throat would do if there was strong negative, what you would feel like if your tissues around your opening to your trachea were to collapse in and just not let air in. But aside from it, it is somewhat of a pathological condition. It's somewhat the way that some horses are designed, but these tissues are just forced to put up with such a strong pressure, negative pressure, that creates one of the major problems. It's kind of a system that works inverse of what's needed. It doesn't get easier the faster they go; it gets harder.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Go ahead. Sorry.
so then you add to that, then, well, now we're going to put a little pole flexion on them. Okay, well, guess what? It's just a tube, and if you take a paper towel, the tube, and you bend it, well, welcome to significant pole flexion behind the vertical. If your bits aren't right, if your girth is too tight, we start adding all these things to a horse. So we go into the performance area, we start adding things to what the horse um, already has working against them, and we can
Hmm.
make it worse for them.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. You're not setting yourself up for success, or not setting the horse up for success by having these equipment failures, um, and failures in form and whatnot. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Um, so are there signs, like you kind of got into this with the performance issues, but are there any specific signs riders might notice under saddle that suggest a horse is struggling to breathe optimally?
Um, you can always listen to their respiratory rate, I, but it's tricky. I've talked to some eventers that have told me that they don't care about heart rate. I mean, I've got all these heart monitors, which are cool, but if the respiratory system isn't there, and this isn't my bias on the respiratory is a real easy thing to be measuring and listening to the horse, because they're trying to tell you something with how they're breathing, the rhythm of their breathing. But again, it's more insidious in that it's just they're not as eager to go. They're just not performing to snuff. They don't get the top speed they may have otherwise gotten. Is that there's something going on in the respiratory? I mean, there could be, again, these are big animals that can't talk to us, but it becomes one of those things that you're kind of backed into the diagnosis when the horse isn't performing the way you'd like him to. And you can do a workup. You can scope them. You can do a lot of things. We can do more endoscopic mobile endoscopy, so we can look at what's going on in the upper airways. The lower areas get a little bit trickier. There are tools like X-ray and ultrasound to figure out what might be going on in the lung. But again, it might not be the first place you're going to look. You're going to think maybe, well, its belly isn't feeling good, it's ulcer, or it's a little bit sore somewhere. So it seems like the lungs are something you're backed into. And in fairness, at least if it's a lameness, you've got ultrasound that's pretty good at maybe picking up a soft tissue injury, or you've got uh, X-rays, CT scans, other imaging tools. The lungs is a trickier organ to get at. So we're going to look at the things that are um, easiest to deal with and easiest to diagnose up front, and then you're going to work your way through. But anytime you
Yeah.
have poor performance on your mind, the airway needs to be thought about and the lungs need to be thought about.
Yeah. Wow, absolutely. Um, how does fatigue in the respiratory system show up compared to muscular fatigue?
That's going to be, I think that's hard to tease out because, again, the respiratory system is just taking air in, right? It's a system of cartilage and soft tissue that's made to pull air in and out, and it pulls it in and out by the muscles, by the diaphragm, and by this horse's stride. And so what we see is if the lungs aren't performing properly because they're not effectively bringing oxygen in, you're probably not going to see it necessarily in the lungs as much as you are in the muscle fatigue when the horse starts sweating. Um, it's signs that just the general body isn't working as well as it should because it's not getting the oxygen it needs. So I think typically it's going to show up in the musculature and in other systems in the body as a result of what's going on in the lungs. But I'm trying to think, I don't think you necessarily see a distinct, this is the lung by itself. It's tied to what the lungs are trying to do. It's the system that it's feeding that starts to have the breakdown or starts to perform poorly, unless there are conditions, a horse that has paralyzed arytenoids, we call them roarers, but there's a
Mm-hmm.
paralysis of the opening, the cartilages that are at the opening of the trachea, which do a great job to close when food does go past it. But then they need to open properly. There are some paralysis that goes on, and these arytenoid cartilages just don't open. And those horses oftentimes make noise. People say it sounds like a freight train. There's other conditions that happen called dorsal displacement of the soft palate. You remember I said they have this really long soft palate and it separates the mouth and the nose? Well, sometimes it gets screwed up and it gets halfway in between, and now it blocks some of the air going into the lungs. And this is easier to show diagrammatically. And I think on our website we have some things on it. Those horses, they can fix themselves by swallowing. And so you'll pick up these funny swallows. Occasionally, jockeys say they can feel it in their stride because the way they fix that soft palate is they have to swallow. And in doing treadmill studies, it's been shown it takes about three tenths of a second to readjust everything, but that throws the whole stride off. And so there
Mm-hmm.
might be, kind of subtleties like that. The problem is when you're going full tilt, you got jumps in between and other things. To pick that out might be not be as easy as it is to potentially visualize on a diagram what's going on.
Yeah, yeah, I can imagine. Um, okay, can we talk a bit about exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage? Um, I believe you've done extensive research on EIPH. Is that what you call it?
It is what you call
Okay.
exercise-induced pulmonary
Yeah.
hemorrhage.
Can you explain what it is in clear, simple terms, or as simple as we can get on a topic like this?
Sure. Um, so let's start with. I was just having a discussion with a researcher in England who who's who said, it's probably not really hemorrhage because it while blood cells leak out, when we look at the stuff that's in the lungs, it's a little bit different ratio of cells to fluid than blood is, and that right away tells us that, okay, while there is some actual bleeding, that blood vessels do rupture, we'll get to that. It's kind of leakiness of these cells in the blood vessels that allows fluid to ooze out of the blood vessels. So what happens? Um, I said the horse is a really super athlete, and one of the reasons they're a really super athlete is that the ability of oxygen, when it goes down into the lungs, into what are called air sacs. So you breathe, and at the end of the path of the airways, it all comes into a little sac called an alveoli. And it's at that point that the blood vessels in the lungs go right next to that sac, and they're waiting. So when the oxygen in that sac comes in, it jumps across the membrane and hops onto the red blood cells moving in these small capillaries in the lungs. These are very small capillaries, and in fact, they're about the dimension is about the dimension of a red blood cell. And if you look at electron microscope images, you'll actually see red blood cells kind of stacked against each other, wanting to get through there. If you take the horse's lungs and you open it up, it's supposed to cover, I think, 6 tennis courts. But that's all surface area for oxygen to get into these alveoli surfaces and jump across onto the red blood cells so it can be carried through the body. So, what happens? When you pick up speed and you ask a horse to start going faster, they're going to need more oxygen. And where do they get the oxygen from? The blood. So, what do? Well, first, the horse is pretty unique in that they can blood dope themselves. They can give themselves more blood. And the way they do it is their spleens are reservoirs for blood. And so when a horse is getting warmed up, when you're exercising it, to get it warmed up, yeah, I know we want to get the joints loosened up and we want to get the blood flowing. But one of the things you want to do is you want the spleen to go, oh, you're going to need more red blood cells, and it contracts and it shoves red blood cells out into the circulation. Packed cell volume is a measure of the concentration of red blood cells to serum in blood. So say average is 37%, it's red blood cells, and the remainder is plasma and other things that are in blood. After splenic contraction, that can go as high as 68 to 70%. I mean, they can double their blood volume of their red blood cells. So one, we just gave their blood system a big dose of red blood cells, which is good, because now you give me all that oxygen you can, and we got red blood cells ready to absorb it and bring it through the body. The next thing we got to do is now we got all this extra blood, we got to get it there. We got to get it there fast, because remember we said we only have half a second to take in a breath. So we got this oxygen, we got to get rid of the carbon dioxide. We have to move fast, and we move fast by the heart rate picking up, and the heart gets much stronger. The ability of the heart to pump grows stronger, so it can really push this blood around. And that blood's going all through the body. It's going to the muscles, because the muscles now need that oxygen to be able to metabolize the glucose, the components that are going to power energy. So we're speeding up. We've put all this extra blood in there. We've got the heart pumping. What do you think it does to blood pressure? Blood pressure's got to go up, because it's a closed system. So it's going to start going up, and it's going to go up in the lungs. And so in the lungs, these little small capillaries that are typically a unit of measure for pressure is millimeters of mercury. We talk about it outside, how many millimeters of mercury or the pressure is dropping. The horse's lungs, the normal pressure in those small capillaries is about 25 millimeters. It goes up fourfold to about 100 millimeters of mercury when the horse is running full tilt. So there's a lot more pressure in these itty bitty little blood vessels coursing through the lung. But remember, these blood vessels and these air sacs, it's a very thin wall between them, because they're so darn efficient at getting oxygen back and forth. It's because this thing is so efficient. It's about 1/100th the thickness of a human hair that separates the air from the blood. So the blood can drop, the oxygen can jump across. Awesome. Except it's also very vulnerable. It's very fragile, because it is so thin. So that's happening on one side. We just blew a whole bunch more pressure into the lungs of the horse. But on the other side, remember we said we have this big vacuum now that's been turned on to pull air in, okay? So if you look at those little blood vessels, on the inside, they're getting pushed by increased blood pressure. On the outside, we have this vacuum happening, this negative pressure that's pulling on this thing, because when it pulls to bring air in, it also pulls on these membranes. So the membranes have high pressure on one side, low pressure on another. Take a balloon, okay? So if I take a balloon and I keep filling it with water and I start pulling on it, eventually that wall, it's going to break. Or at the very least, the cells that are holding everything together, they're under pressure and they start pulling apart. And guess what happens? Then stuff can start leaking through, and we're going to pick up with what's called exercise-induced hemorrhage. It's what occurs when the horse undergoes exercise and draws this blood out. I hesitate a minute, because one of the questions that comes up, what about humans? Actually, there are humans that get exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage, but because we're bipeds, we stand up and down. Our lungs are sitting up here, the rest of our body is down here, is one reason we don't see it as much. But rowers are a sport where we do see exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage with their sport. So it's the pressures we're putting on this little membrane just because we're asking them to do what they do. And so the question becomes, and I hear people say, well, my horse isn't a bleeder. Guess what? Haven't met one that's not. And so I think we have to look at it realistically, in that this membrane is leaky. Okay, it's leaky for a purpose. It allows oxygen and carbon dioxide to go back and forth, but it comes at a cost that it can be leaky for other things too. So the issue is, how much leakage occurs? Is it physiological? There's always going to be a little bit of leakage. Or is it pathological? There's a ton of leakage that we don't want to have happen. On the lab, on a treadmill, Every horse bleeds when you put them under work. And people say, well, what about horses in pasture? Sure. If you take a horse in pasture and that horse is next to its friend and they're running back up and down, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if there's a rider on it. It's these forces that are going on in the body. Now, there's a couple other things that happen that add to it. One of them is concussion. So the horse is running, and with every stride, what happens? Their legs go forward, they hit the ground, and they break over. Well, remember, they've got how many pounds of gut filled with whatever behind it. So you've got this horse flying through the air, and all of a sudden its leg stops and it jars it, and you got the guts coming right behind that, slam the back of the lungs. So now we have concussive forces too. And when you look at the pattern of bleeding, where it occurs on the top side of the lung and on the back side of the lung, it all is consistent with what's called the visceral piston theory, that you've got this compression of the lungs due to the guts and the stride coming together. And when we first started looking at this, and people said, oh, now we got X-ray, we can see these things on ultrasound where all this bleeding is occurring. And it was earlier, before we even had ultrasounds, we would do postmortems and see the blood up there. And guess what? It's like, well, maybe we shouldn't have riders on their backs, because you put a rider on its back and it's, well, you know what? You put them on a treadmill without a rider on their back, you lunge them hard enough, they could still bleed. So what you want to do is minimize bleeding as much as you can, because the other thing we know is if we take a horse's their own blood and you inject it into the airways, you increase the incidence of the amount of blood you're going to see, because the blood shouldn't be in the airways, it should be in the blood vessels. It's an irritant to the airway. So when we put horses on a treadmill at a trot at a 20-degree incline, you'll see more blood in their lungs. They will bleed more. They will leak more. So when we say 100% of horses bleed, 100% of horses that work hard are going to have more blood in their lungs after hard work. And that comes with it. Is that a bad thing? No, it's a result of the being the athlete they are. However, if it gets severe enough, because over time you add other insults to it, you have allergies, you have respiratory conditions, all of these things compounded. Hard ground, we see a lot more bleeding when the ground gets hard, just because of those concussive forces. And having looked at this, everybody's looking for that silver bullet to stop bleeding. When you hear people or even therapies out there, we stop bleeding. No. And I challenge anyone to show us. You indeed reduce bleeding, and we reduce the amount of it, but we don't stop it. It happens, and it happens because it's a whole bunch of things coming together. It's multifactorial, and typically with something that's caused by multiple issues, you're not going to fix it with a silver bullet. You're going to manage it. You're going to do what you can to reduce the impact of all these forces that are coming together to cause exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage.
So is exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage, is that anytime there's bleeding, or is that a result of the bleeding? That's a more extreme result that happens due to the bleeding?
No, by definition, all exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage means is after exercise, we see that there has been hemorrhage or bleeding into the lung. And as I say, even that it is, and I don't want to ever minimize it, but when you look at the actual material in the lung, it's not pure frank blood, like everything blew open and all this blood came gushing out. It's blood oozed out because of pressure, these pressures. And so one of the questions I've had, and I'll digress a minute because I got to a debate again with this researcher in England. I said, do horses have strokes? No, horses don't have strokes. But in humans, what do they warn you when your blood pressure goes up? You're a candidate for stroke. You're going to have a higher incidence of stroke. And so my question was, look, if horses don't have a stroke, but their blood pressure goes way up here, could bleeding just be a pressure relief valve? And they need to reduce the pressure. And he adamantly said, no, no. And then he said, well, I wrote it down to explore it further. We don't know for sure, but for some reason, yeah, all this pressure builds up in the lungs. Part of it came with being this athlete that it is, but so it's a blessing and a curse, but it does happen in all horses. Anytime they start working significantly hard, we're going to see more blood in there. And the issue is there a lot of blood or a little blood? Is it pathological or is it physiological? And by that, I mean, you're always going to expect some leakage from a leaky system. It's when it's gushing out the nose, that's probably pretty bad. But when you see it at the nose, that's very rare. If you take thoroughbred racehorses where 100% of the horses, it's well known when we scope them, they have bled. 3 to 5% they show it at the nose. And so one of the things you might see with horses is you're bringing it back and they're swallowing a lot. Have you ever had a bloody nose?
Yeah.
What do? I mean, you got this blood running back and it triggers a swallow reflex and you're swallowing. And you'll see these horses that they're swallowing more, they don't cool out as well, or they're just running beautiful and they hit a wall. They just stop. That's probably a pretty significant bleed that occurred in the lungs. And then when you check them, what do? We go and scope them, right? Pass an endoscope down. We look in the lungs. We do it because it's convenient, not because it tells the whole story. Bleeding occurs way back in the lung. And so you can look down a scope and you will see nothing but the horse bled.
Mm-hmm.
And so in thoroughbreds, it's been shown statistically that if you scope a horse 3 times, you're going to see blood. But scoping it once doesn't tell the whole story. And so when I was on the racetrack, there would be times that we'd watch this horse running and it would just hit a wall. So I'd get it back to the barn, let's scope it. You'd pass your scope in, and guess what? It's like, man, it ran like it bled, but there's nothing. Go home, and 3 hours later, I'd get a phone call because we didn't have text then, and they'd say, I'd get the call, hey doc, you know what? I went to feed the horse 4 hours out, and when he put his head down, this big glop of blood came out. Well, it took time for it to migrate from back of the lung down to where it could hit the lower part of the trachea and then slide out.
Wow. Wow. That makes, yeah, sorry, go ahead. I think you have more to say.
Well, and the other thing is we run into these horses that drop dead, and they look at them and they look at their lungs and they go, rarely does exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage kill a horse. Heart problems would kill a horse and then blood backs up. But where you have a major hemorrhage, rarely does exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage cause death in a horse. Exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage causes poor performance, it causes deterioration, but you got to rupture a pulmonary artery or something severe to really bleed out and die. So that's maybe associated with exercise, but it's not what we typically refer to exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage, which is this leakage of blood that occurs because of intense performance.
Yeah, got it. Okay, I want to hear about how did the idea for FLAIR Equine Nasal Strips come about, and kind of what's the problem they're solving? What does that offer the horse?
So the idea came about by a very creative guy named Dr. Ed Block. And Ed and I started practicing together at a clinic in Colorado called Littleton Large Animal Clinic. And we became friends. And over time, we lived in separate parts of the country, but we would always get on the phone and chat about the horse world, about our kids, whatever was going on. And he said to me, I woke up in the middle of the night and I wondered, how come no one ever thought of a breathe right for a horse? And we both started laughing about it and said, wow, that'd be cool. Everybody would go after him. And so that was the start of it. And it was at a time when I had left veterinary medicine. I was now a patent attorney. And I still had friends at the vet school at Minnesota. And so the pathologist was a good friend of mine. And I called him up and said, Tim, I need to look at a horse head. Do you have any postmortems I can go in there and look at? And so I would go in after the D lab was closed, and he'd leave the back door open so I could go in and take my head out of the cooler and start dissecting. We started looking at this area of the nose, saying, so is this possible? Because even after we launched the product, we had veterinarians say it's never going to work because the horse has a false nostril. No, we just don't understand the false nostril. It had nothing to do with that. So we started playing with different ideas that we thought could work to make this thing work. And the biggest trick, as it still is today, is get something to stick. And at the time, Ed was a resident veterinarian for a guy named Monty Roberts, who is on the West Coast. And Monty had a track on his farm. And so we could play with these things. We go out with the Gallup people in the morning, and we, cut these things and stick them on. And sometimes they didn't stick, and you grab a piece of duct tape and you just put it over the thing to make it. And then pretty soon some of the jockeys or the Gallup people would come back and go, this horse usually makes a noise. It's not making a noise today. So we sent it off to a university, which will remain nameless. And they sent me a letter saying, you're crazy. This thing doesn't work. It's never going to work. And I said, is it possible you don't know what you're measuring? Absolutely not. We know what we're measuring. So life went on. We were undaunted by it. And the Human Breatherite Company came to us and said, we've had veterinarians tell us about this. Why do you think it's going to work? And this was on New Year's Eve, like in 2000. And I went out to my car and I brought in a horse's skull and I put it on the table. And the CEO, Dan Cohn, who was a neurologist by training, he was the CEO of this company, he was a smart man, but his training was, he had worked a lot on sleep apnea and problems with humans. So I put the head in front of him, he goes, oh, we missed that. This will totally work. And it was just, the light bulb went on. So his question to me though was, what's it going to do? Because if it's a gimmick, it's going to be dead in the horse form. I said, yeah, well, I think it reduces bleeding. And he said, do you have any data for that? No. So he went to Kansas State University, which at the time was a leader in studying exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage. And they took 7 known bleeders and put them on a treadmill, and they looked at whether or not the strips reduced bleeding. And 7 out of 7 horses, it reduced bleeding. It's like, yep, we're right. It would reduce bleeding. And then after that came out, we had a couple studies come out on bleeding. And although he doesn't remember it, because I've talked to him about it afterwards, Dr. Larry Bramlett at Root and Riddle said to me one day, look, either it makes the horse breathe easier or not. Why is it reducing bleeding? And Michigan State University did a study just to find out, studying the upper airway, what's going on. And aside from the bleeding, we could show that by supporting that tissue, which was the narrowest part of the upper airway, it reduced the resistance to bringing air in. So we always want to make clear that it doesn't give the horse more oxygen, because I told you that this horse has a VO2 max. They're limited by how much oxygen they can take, but they can take it in with less work. And so if they can take it in with less work, they use less energy to bring it in. And that helps, not only does it, we can talk about why it reduces bleeding, but it also, that whole energy cascade where I was talking about the diaphragm and when the fatigue sets in. Well, if that diaphragm has to work less hard to pull in the same amount of air, guess what? It doesn't consume as much oxygen, and that oxygen can stay out at the muscles circulating. In the lungs, what it does is, because I said there was a strong pressure pulling on that vasculature, if you think of a vacuum and you open the tube of the vacuum, what happens? Your suction force goes down because it got spread over a bigger area. So by putting the nasal strip on, they have to work less hard. That suction force to get the same amount of air can be less. And so there's less pulling on this side of the membrane. On the other hand, there's a drug out there called Lasix, which is given to reduce bleeding. And Lasix is a diuretic, and it causes a horse to pee 15 pounds. And so what does that do? Remember I said there was all this pressure in this blood vessel? If you take some of the fluid out of the body, there's not that much pressure in this blood vessel, so there's more pushing out. So we've done studies with both FLAIR and Lasix to show there is a synergistic effect that, particularly in severe bleeders, they working together do reduce bleeding, but at high speed, they're about the same efficacy in reducing bleeding. Except
Wow.
FLAIR, we don't have any tolerance effects. Over time, drugs you
Yeah.
have to give more to get the same effect. We don't have that with the mechanical thing like FLAIR.
Yeah. It is absolutely incredible what you've created, and such a value add to the entire equestrian industry. And that's just, I mean, that's so much to be proud of and just really awesome. Where can people learn more about FLAIR? I mean, you can kind of, you kind of find them everywhere. They're kind of ubiquitous at this point. But where do people find out more about FLAIR, about your company, about the innovations that you're making? How do they find you?
FLAIRstrips.com is, or our socials at FLAIR Strips. We try to put a lot of material up. There are several veterinarians who work with us to write papers and publications to give people as much information as they can, because every one of these horses is different. We're always trying to tweak the best thing we can. And stay tuned, because there are some changes on the horizon. But one of the things we did start looking at recently was we've always studied the nose from the inside, and we've put pressure tubes in the nose, and we put masks on, and we're measuring airflow. And so a while back, I started wondering what's going on the outside of the nose, particularly when we think about throat problems. Oftentimes we put an endoscope in the horse's throat, and then we gallop them. And we just added a variable to it all, right?
Mhm.
Because you've got them galloping, and now, but you're taking up this much space. So how much did that change what's really going on? So I wondered if, because of these negative pressures going in and out, the tissues on the nose can tell us something that's going on in the nose without sticking something in the nose. Can we measure from the outside? So we've been studying the outside of the nose, and I'll be releasing some videos soon as we wrap up the data on this. But if you look at that tissue on the horse's nose, it just flutters. It just flutters. When they're trying to take air in, this tissue is just fluttering. And then on top of it, when we look at barrel horses and they come in full tilt and the brakes go on and they start spinning the barrel, all those tissues just kind of slide forward and collapse in and further collapse out. Horses coming over the finish line when they're breathing hard in races. I got to go back and look at some close-ups of the nose from horses crossing the finish line in Dubai, where there were these great cameras, and you just see these tissues fluttering in. But the whole goal is just stabilize it. Just stabilize that tissue so it doesn't have that much flutter, and it's going to help allow air to get in there freely, or more free than it would without it. And
Yeah.
that will be on our website, and we'll be socializing soon as we pull the data and the videos together on that.
So cool. That is really, really exciting. Everyone stay tuned and follow FLAIR Strips on social and subscribe to their email list so that you can stay tuned on that, because that is something that I definitely want to learn more about. But Jim, in the meantime, we really appreciate you sharing your expertise tonight and sharing your expertise with just the general equestrian community through these products. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it. Great to see you again.
You
Look forward to
too.
seeing you at Defender in a few months.
Absolutely. We'll catch you there, and we'll have you on again soon to talk about the next iteration of these products that you're working on. Thanks so much, Jim.
Great. Thanks again. Have a good evening.